The rain fell like judgment that morning, cold and relentless, turning the training field into a wound of brown water and churned earth. Mara hit the mud face first, the shove from behind knocking the breath clean out of her lungs. Laughter rippled through the recruits, standing in formation. She lay there for one heartbeat, two, feeling the cold seep through her uniform and into her bones. And then, slowly, she began to rise. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. Her name was Mara Ellison, 23 years old, the only woman in a platoon of 31 recruits at a training base tucked deep in the pine forests of the north. She hadn't come here to be liked. She'd come here to prove something, not to the men around her, but to herself. 6 months earlier, a doctor had told her she'd never regain full strength in her left knee after the accident that took her brother. She'd spent every night since then proving that doctor wrong, 1 mile at a time. Corporal Dane Whitlock didn't know any of that. All he knew was that a woman had beaten his personal best on the obstacle course 3 days running, and it made something ugly twist in his chest. So when the drill instructor turned his back during the morning crawl, Dane's hand found her shoulder and pushed. Hard. She went down into the mud like a stone dropped in a pond, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The other recruits froze. Some smirked. Others looked away, ashamed of their own silence. Somewhere behind the tree line, a hawk cried out, and the sound seemed to hang in the wet air longer than it should have. Mara felt the mud fill her mouth, her ears, the creases of her knuckles. She thought about her brother's laugh. She thought about the doctor's words. And something inside her, something that had been coiled tight for months, finally released. She thought she'd never stand up in front of these men and feel like she belonged. She was wrong. Mara pushed herself onto her hands, water dripping in long ropes from her chin, and looked up, not at Dane, but past him, at the finish flag flapping in the distance through the gray sheets of rain. Her knee screamed. She ignored it. Around her, the other recruits had gone utterly still, the kind of stillness that comes right before something unforgettable happens. Even the instructor, 20 yards off, had turned to watch, his clipboard forgotten at his side. She didn't say a word to Dane. She didn't need to. She simply rose to her feet, mud sliding off her shoulders in thick dark sheets, and broke into a run. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't clean. Her boots slipped twice in the first 50 yards, and both times she caught herself before she fell, driven by something deeper than muscle, something that lived in the space between grief and defiance. The rain came harder now, needling against her skin, but she barely felt it. Somewhere behind her, she heard Dane's boots pounding after her, and then the boots of the others, the whole platoon suddenly moving like a tide pulled by a moon none of them could see, drawn into a race none of them had planned to run. Was it fair, some of the recruits would ask themselves later, to have let it come to this? To have stood by while a woman was pushed into the mud rather than stepping in? The question would linger in the barracks long after the drill ended, an uncomfortable stone none of them could quite swallow. Mara crossed the first checkpoint 6 seconds ahead of the nearest runner. By the second, she'd doubled her lead. The instructor's whistle shrieked through the rain, but nobody was sure if it meant stop or keep going. And nobody, least of all Mara, was inclined to find out. Her lungs burned. Her knee throbbed with a fire she hadn't felt since the accident. And still she ran, because somewhere beneath the pain was a girl who had promised her brother she would never stop moving forward, no matter who tried to push her down. She crossed the final line 11 seconds ahead of Dane Whitlock, collapsing onto her knees in the mud one final time, not from defeat, but from a triumph so complete it emptied her all at once. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of shame. It was the silence of 31 people realizing, all at once, that they had just watched something they would never forget. Then someone began to clap. Then another. And within moments, the whole field erupted, even Dane's hands moving slowly, reluctantly, into the sound of an apology he didn't yet have the words for. Because kindness doesn't vanish. It waits, and it finds its way back, sometimes in the shape of a hand extended in the mud, sometimes in the sound of applause from people who once stayed silent. And somewhere in that field, soaked and shaking and utterly alive, Mara Ellison finally understood that the ground that once tried to swallow her had only ever been teaching her how to rise. If this story moved you, Tell us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week, we bring you true tales of courage that remind us why getting back up is the whole point.